USS Warrington, DD-383, was sailing from Norfolk to Trinidad Island when on 12 September 1944, the crew was warned that they were sailing straight towards a massive hurricane. The ship made it through the night, but by early morning the storm grew in intensity and began to severely hamper the Warrington. Water rushed through the ship's vents and knocked out all power. Warrington's crew tried desperately to save their ship, but it was apparent the Warrington was taking too much water and would have to be abandoned. The ship sank at 12:50, leaving her crew stranded in the fierce storm. After several days of searching, only 73 of the ship's 321 crew were rescued. Bagley class. USS Blue, DD-387, was patrolling Ironbottom Sound on the night of 22 August 1942 when she picked up the Japanese destroyer Kawakaze on her radar. At that moment, a torpedo struck the Blue on her stern, nearly blowing it off completely. 9 men were killed and 21 wounded. Over the next 24 hours, attempts were made to tow the ship, but after these efforts failed, she was scuttled. USS Mugford, DD-389, was covering the 7 August 1942 landings on Guadalcanal when at 13:20, a large Japanese airstrike attempted to disrupt the landings. Mugford was targeted by several dive bombers who managed to land a 250 kg bomb on the stern of the destroyer, causing minimal damage. 18 men were killed and another 17 wounded. The ship would remain on station through September 1942. While patrolling the Surigao Strait on the afternoon of 5 December 1944, a lone Val kamikaze managed to slip past her anti-aircraft fire and struck the Mugford on her port side. 8 men were killed and 16 wounded. The ship temporarily lost power and had to be towed away until she was able to extinguish fires and proceed under her own power back to the States for repairs. The ship returned to service in March 1945. USS Ralph Talbot, DD-390, was on patrol off Savo Island during the night of 7-8 August 1942, when at 2:15, a Japanese heavy cruiser appeared out of the darkness. The two ships exchanged fire. Ralph Talbot was hit 4 times, which killed 12 men and wounded several more. Ralph Talbot limped away with her bridge on fire and listing heavily to starboard. The crew was able to save their ship and sufficiently patch up to make for major repairs stateside. By January 1943, she was back fighting the war. On the evening of 27 April, Ralph Talbot was screening off Hagushi when 2 kamikazes attacked her at 2040. One struck her starboard side aft and the other crashed close aboard. The ship began to flood, but was quickly brought under control and the ship headed to Caramaretto for repairs. Her casualties were 5 dead and 9 wounded. 1. USS Henley, DD-391, was conducting an offensive sweep off Finschhafen with 2 other destroyers on 3 October 1943, when her captain ordered evasive maneuvers to avoid 2 torpedoes fired from the submarine Row 108 headed for the ship. Henley dodged the first 2 warheads, but a 3rd torpedo struck the ship on her port side, exploded in her boiler rooms, and broke her keel, which nearly halved the ship in 2. The crew abandoned their destroyer and were rescued by her fellow tin cans. 15 men went down with Henley. USS Patterson, DD-392, was patrolling with 2 heavy cruisers south of Savo Island on 9 August 1942, when at 1:45 she ran head-on into a Japanese task force of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. After sending by radio and signal lamp, "Warning! Warning! Strange ships entering the harbor," Patterson fired star shells and engaged the enemy warships, but was quickly hit by 5 5.5-inch, 14 cm shells from the light cruiser Yubari that knocked out No. 4 gun and damaged No. 3 gun. 10 men were killed and 8 were wounded. The ship made repairs and remained in action. On 30 September 1943, while engaging Japanese barges in New Georgia Sound, the Slot, a damaged friendly destroyer attempting to rejoin the formation collided with Patterson, nearly breaking off the ship's bow forward of the No. 1 gun, which eventually did separate. 3 men were killed and 10 were wounded in the accident. The ship had to have a false bow installed for its trip stateside for repairs. The Patterson rejoined the war in March 1944. USS Jarvis, DD-393, was defending the Guadalcanal landings on 8 August 1942 when 26 Japanese bombers attacked at 1200. Jarvis maneuvered between the enemy planes and the cruiser USS Vincennes when she was struck by an aerial torpedo on her starboard side, which knocked out all power and killed 14 of her crew and wounded 7. The ship made sufficient repairs to make for Sydney, Australia, during the night to have immediate work done on her 50-foot gash in her side. Her wounded were transferred off at Chilagi before she left. While leaving the Guadalcanal area on 9 August 1942, at 1:30, she steamed right past a Japanese task force on their way to meet the Americans near Savo Island. It is unclear if Jarvis' crew were aware of the enemy ships, but the Japanese considered an escaping cruiser. The next day, while the Jarvis was slowly steaming towards Australia down by the bow, with no radio and few working guns, she was pounced on by 31 Japanese planes. The Japanese recorded that Jarvis split and sank at 1300 on 9 August 1942. Of her 223 crew remaining on board, not a single man survived. Benham class. USS Benham, DD-397, was operating with TF-64 on the night of 14-15 November 1942 near Guadalcanal, on course to intercept a Japanese task force headed to bombard Henderson Field. The two sides engaged in combat just before midnight. At 38, Benham took a torpedo hit off her bow, possibly from the Japanese destroyer Shiryuki. The blast carried away the bow of the ship forward of the bridge, causing Benham to retreat from the battle. Although she suffered no casualties during the fight, the ship was severely damaged and the crew gave up efforts to save her. Benham would be scuttled by USS Gwin, DD-433. USS Merritt, DD-402, was conducting anti-aircraft duties off Palermo, Italy on 26 May 1943 when she was attacked by German dive bombers. A near miss landed just a yard off the port bow, which ruptured the hull and flooded the engineering space of the ship. 5 men were killed and another 18 wounded. Despite the serious damage to the ship, her crew was able to save the Merritt and make it back to a safe port. The ship would return to service in May 1944. USS Rowan, DD-405, was assisting the landings in the Gulf of Salerno on 10 September 1942 when her convoy of ships was attacked by German E-boats shortly after midnight. As Rowan turned to have all her guns engage the enemy, she was struck by a torpedo. Rowan sank in less than a minute, taking 202 of her crew down with her. 71 of her men were rescued. USS Sterett, DD-407, was operating with TF-67 on the night of 13 November 1942, which was heading to meet a Japanese surface task force head-on just off Guadalcanal. The two sides met with one another in the pitch-black night at 1:30, and quickly the battle became a frenzied shootout. Sterett was hit 4 times by Japanese battleship Hia, which knocked out her rudder. Despite this, the crew maintained fire on the enemy ships, helping to sink the Japanese destroyer Udachi. However, Sterett herself was ambushed by the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze and hit by 11 5-inch, 127 shells, destroying her forward guns and torpedo tubes and setting the ship on fire. 28 of her crew were killed in the battle, and another 13 seriously wounded. Sterett remained afloat and was able to depart the battle area for emergency repairs. She would rejoin the war on 10 February 1943. On 9 April 1945, while on picket duty off Okinawa, Sterett was attacked by 5 kamikazes. The crew shot down the first 3, but the 4th plane to come in struck the starboard waterline. All power was lost, steering was knocked out and her main guns frozen in place. 2 of her men were wounded, but the veteran crew was able to quickly restore power and got the ship underway again for repairs. 2. USS Wilson, DD-408, was on patrol off Karamaredo on 16 April 1945 when she observed two Japanese aircraft and took them under fire. One made a run on her and was shot down 75 yards to starboard, ricocheted off the water and hit Wilson in her 40 gun tub. It then spun across the deck and landed in the water on the port side. Its 220 lb bomb penetrated the ship, but only the booster charge went off, causing slight damage. It was removed intact from the ship a couple of days later. Wilson had 5 dead and 3 wounded in the attack, but the damage was minimal. She was repaired and back in action within a few days. 3. Sims Glass. USS Sims, DD-409, was escorting the fleet oiler USS Neosho during the Battle of Coral Sea on 7 May 1942, when the two ships were sighted by a Japanese search plane. The pilot identified the destroyer and oiler as a cruiser and carrier, respectively. A large group of Japanese bombers from the aircraft carriers Shikaku and Zuikaku soon appeared at 0930 and circled the two American ships searching for the reported carrier, but settled on the Sims and Neosho when their fuel ran low. The Sims was hit by 3 250 kg bombs, 2 of which exploded in the engine room. In minutes, the ship buckled amidships and began to sink stern first. As she went down, Sims exploded, killing many of her men in the water. Of a crew of 192, only 16 men were rescued. USS Hughes, DD-410, was operating off the southern tip of Leyte on 10 December 1944 when she was attacked by a G-4M Betty kamikaze which crashed into the ship, causing severe damage. The ship's engine room and much of her machinery was demolished. Hughes' crew suffered 2 men killed and 21 wounded. She was towed to San Pedro Bay, where temporary repairs enabled her to travel stateside. After extensive repairs, Hughes rejoined the war on 4 June 1945. USS Anderson, DD-411, was participating in a diversionary bombardment of Watch during the Marshall Islands campaign on 30 January 1944, when during the bombardment the ship was hit by a shell fired from a shore battery. The shell hit the Combat Information Center on board, killing 6 and wounding 14 others. The damage was minimal, and Anderson remained on station. On 1 November 1944, while on patrol near Panyan Island, Anderson was attacked by a Ki-43 Oscar, which dove at her at 1812. Despite being hit by 20 and 40 shells, the plane got through, caught its right wingtip on the ship's stack and hit the ship's port side. Burning gasoline covered the deck area of the crash, and the boilers were put out of commission by the impact. The fires were out by 1855. Afterwards, Anderson counted 16 dead and 20 wounded. USS Hammond, DD-412, was assisting in the effort to save the crippled aircraft carrier USS Yorktown on 6 June 1942. Hammond was alongside the stricken carrier, transferring damage control parties, when after 1200, Japanese submarine I-168 successfully penetrated the screen of protecting destroyers and fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. One of the torpedoes hit Hammond amidships, breaking her in half. The ship's 2 halves sank, bow first, within 4 minutes. After the stern went under, Hammond's depth charges exploded in a violent underwater explosion, killing many more men in the water. 80 of her crew went down with the Hammond. USS O'Brien, DD-415, was escorting a convoy of troop transports in company with USS Wasp, CV-7, on 15 September 1942, when the American ships were targeted by Japanese submarine I-19. A spread of 6 torpedoes was fired which sank the Wasp and damaged battleship North Carolina. O'Brien evaded 1 torpedo and was then struck by a second on her port bow. Damage at first did not seem significant and the ship made full power. However, the damage to the ship would haunt the crew despite the repairs they attempted to make at Espiritu Santo. The ship departed for San Francisco for more extensive repairs on 10 October. As she made headway, the ship gradually leaked more water. By 18 October, the crew started jettisoning topside weight to attempt to save the ship, but it became clear the O'Brien would have to make the nearest port. At 600 on 19 October, the ship started to come apart, prompting the crew to abandon ship, except for a small salvage team, who also left the ship 30 minutes later. By 800, O'Brien slipped beneath the sea after traveling 3,000 miles with torpedo damage. Fortunately, none of her crew were lost. USS Walk, DD-416, was sailing with TF-64 on the night of 14-15 November 1942, when around 23:30, the American ships engaged a Japanese task force south of Savo Island. Walk was engaging Japanese ships with her main battery, when at 39 the ship was shaken by a tremendous explosion from a torpedo fired from the Japanese destroyer Samadare on her starboard side. The crew was ordered to abandon the fast-sinking ship. Walk's stern was the last part of the ship to sink underwater. As it did, several depth charges exploded, killing and wounding several men left in the water. After 2 encounters with enemy vessels who luckily left without firing, 151 survivors were rescued in the morning by USS Meade, DD-602. 72 men went down with the Walk in her final battle, and 6 more survivors died of their wounds. USS Morris, DD-417, was operating off Okinawa and Karamaredo on 6 April 1945, when at 1811 she was targeted by a B-5N Kate kamikaze. Despite taking several hits, the flaming plane continued on to crash into the ship on the portside between the No. 1 and No. 2 5-inch guns. Fires quickly spread, and it took over 2 hours to extinguish them. The Morris suffered 13 dead, 45 wounded, 4. The ship's steering was damaged and her bow was demolished, but temporary repairs allowed the Morris to cross the Pacific to San Francisco. The ship was declared neither seaworthy or habitable and was not repaired. USS Buck, DD-420, was on patrol off Salerno on the night of 9 October 1943 when just after midnight, German submarine U-616 ambushed the destroyer with possibly 2 torpedo strikes on her forward starboard side. The Buck flooded quickly and sank within 4 minutes. As the ship sank, her depth charges, which had been set to safety, detonated, causing a severe underwater explosion that killed and wounded many sailors in the water. 95 men were killed when Buck sank. Benson class. USS Mayo, DD-422, was assisting Allied troops landing at Anzio on 24 January 1944, when at 20:01 the ship struck a mine on her starboard side. 7 men were killed and 25 were wounded by the explosion, which almost broke the ship in 2. Fortunately, the ship held together and survived a tow back to Naples for temporary patching and eventually back to the States for permanent repairs. Mayo required some 4 months of repairs before she returned to service. USS Lansdale, DD-426, was escorting a convoy off the coast of Algeria during the night of 20 April 1944, when the convoy came under concentrated attacks by Luftwaffe bombers. The SS Paul Hamilton, steaming ahead of Lansdale, was struck by a torpedo at 21:00 and exploded in an enormous fireball, killing all 580 on board, as well as illuminating all nearby ships in the darkness. Lansdale was attacked on 2 sides, and while turning to avoid torpedoes, she was struck by another on her opposite side by a daring Ju-88, which was shot down as it passed a few feet above the ship. Lansdale was nearly split in 2 and started listing to port. After hanging on for another 10 minutes and continuing to fire at attacking enemy planes, the captain decided it was time to abandon ship. The destroyer broke in half and quickly sank, taking 47 men down with her. 147 of her crew and 2 Germans were rescued from the water. USS Laffey, DD-459, was operating with TF-67 on the night of 13-14 November 1942 off Guadalcanal, when at 1:48, combat was initiated with a Japanese force including 2 battleships and 14 destroyers. During the action in a pitch-black night, the 2 sides of ships mixed, firing on friend and foe alike. Laffey nearly collided with Japanese battleship Hii, missing the behemoth by 20 feet, and then raked the bridge and superstructure of the battleship at point-blank range. Unfortunately, she was then tracked by the light cruiser Nagara and the destroyer Yukikaze, the latter hitting Laffey with three 5-inch, 127 shells which destroyed her turret too, followed by two 14-inch, 356 hits from Hii to her bridge and superstructure. The fatal blow came when one of Yukikaze's torpedoes blew off Laffey's stern and propellers, broke her keel, disabled electrical power, and started a massive fire. As her crew started to abandon ship, Laffey was ripped apart as the fires caused by Yukikaze's torpedo hit detonated her turret 4 magazines, and the destroyer quickly sank with 59 of her crew killed and 116 wounded. USS Fahrenheit DD-491 was steaming with a task force on the night of 11-12 October 1942 on course to intercept Japanese shipping runs to Guadalcanal. In the ensuing Battle of Cape Esperance, Fahrenheit was hit by shells below the waterline from both Japanese and American guns, causing concerning flooding. The crew shifted weight topside so the ship listed far enough to raise the holes out of the water. 3 men were killed and 43 wounded on Fahrenheit. After lengthy repairs, she returned to service in March 1943. On 25 February 1944, Fahrenheit's destroyer squadron made a hit-and-run bombardment of Japanese facilities and positions on Kavieng. The Japanese responded with a heavy counterfire from shore batteries which hold the Fahrenheit at the waterline. Fortunately, there were no casualties, and the ship's experienced crew quickly brought the flooding under control. USS Bailey, DD-492, was operating with TF-8 on 27 March 1943, attempting to prevent a Japanese convoy from resupplying troops in the Aleutians Islands. The Americans made contact with the enemy convoy 730, but soon realized they were outnumbered and outgunned. During the gun duel between ships, Bailey was hit by 4 8-inch, 203 shells from Japanese heavy cruiser Nachi, killing 5 men, wounding 8 more, and bringing the ship to a stop. She would be repaired first at Dutch Harbor, then proceeded to Mare Island Navy Yard for permanent repairs. Bailey returned to service in October 1943. USS Barton, DD-599, was operating with TF-67 on 13-14 November 1942 when the American ships engaged a Japanese surface task force in the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. The two sides engaged in combat at 1:48, and the battle quickly turned into a chaotic, wild shootout in the pitch-black night. During the fight, Barton was firing at point-blank range on nearby enemy ships when suddenly the friendly cruiser Helena appeared directly in Barton's path. The ship came to a complete stop to avoid colliding with the larger cruiser, but before she could get moving again, Barton was hit by 2 torpedoes amidships fired by the Japanese destroyer Amatsukaze. The huge explosions broke the Barton in two, and she quickly sank. 168 of her crew went down with the Barton, while 42 survivors were rescued. USS Murphy, DD-603, was supporting the Operation Torch landings on 8 November 1942 when, during an exchange of fire with a French shore battery, she was hit by a shell that penetrated the engine room, killing 3 men and wounding 25. Prompt and effective damage control allowed the ship to remain in action to complete the bombardment. The ship returned to Boston for repairs on 24 November. On 21 October 1943, Murphy was escorting a convoy 75 miles off the coast of New Jersey when she was accidentally rammed by the oil tanker SS Bulkel between her first and second stacks. The forward third of the ship separated and sank, while the remaining stern section of the ship was towed back to New York Navy Yard. 36 men were killed in the accident. The Murphy had its bow replaced and returned to service in time to participate in Operation Overlord. USS Caldwell, DD-605, was escorting landing craft at Ormoc on 12 December 1944 when at 8:05 she was jumped by several enemy planes. A trio of A-6M0 fighters made bombing runs on the ship. Caldwell was hit by 2 bombs. One of the diving planes turned on its back and struck the bridge of the destroyer. Fires broke out which were quickly brought under control, but the damage was extensive and required repairs. 33 of her crew was killed and another 40 wounded. The ship would return to the war to participate in the Okinawa campaign. USS Gansevoort DD-608 was operating near Mindanao on 30 December 1944, protecting unloading landing craft, when at 15:48 an enemy plane was observed dropping a bomb on a friendly ship and then turning towards the Gansevoort. The destroyer put up a barrage of fire, but the incoming kamikaze struck the port side of the ship, its bomb exploding below deck, starting fires and causing a list. The destroyer was aided by her fellow tin cans until all fires were out. 17 crewmen were killed and another 15 wounded. Gansevoort was towed to a nearby anchorage and had to endure more air raids before she was sufficiently repaired to make for a larger naval yard. USS Calc DD-611 was patrolling off Biak Island on 12 June 1944 when a lone dive bomber dove out of the sun and landed its bomb abaft of the forward stack. The explosion sprayed shrapnel all over the ship, killing and wounding 70 men. Luckily, the ship's torpedoes did not explode despite being mangled by the bomb hit. The fires were put out and volunteers detached the live warheads from the torpedoes. Calc made for San Francisco to make repairs and returned to fight the war in October 1944. USS Kendrick DD-612 was en route to Iran on 2 September 1943 when she was surprised by a German Heinkel He-111 flying 50 feet over the water, which dropped 2 torpedoes at the Kendrick. Although the enemy plane was shot down, one of the torpedoes it launched hit the ship's stern, killing 1 man, damaging steering and the fantail. The ship's crew threw a life raft to the enemy crew in the water and continued on their way to Iran. Kendrick would have to be towed back to the States and was out of action until February 1944. USS McLanahan DD-615 was participating in a bombardment patrol off the Ligurian coast when on 11 February 1945, a near miss by a large caliber shell sprayed the ship with shrapnel and knocked out a gun turret. 1 man was killed and 8 others wounded. Her damage was negligible and the ship remained on station. Gleaves class USS Plunkett DD-431 was acting as a screen for transports landing at Cape Anzio on 24 January 1944 when she came under attack by Luftwaffe Junkers Ju-88 bombers at 17:38. In a raid lasting 17 minutes, Plunkett was struck by a 550 lb bomb which killed 51, wounded many more, knocked out an engine, and started several fires. The fires were extinguished by 1821. Plunkett was towed to Palermo and eventually the States for major repairs. She returned in time to participate in the Normandy invasion. USS Carney DD-432 was assisting a British convoy under attack from a German Wolfpack of submarines on the morning of 17 October 1941, when the ship was hit on her starboard side by a torpedo from U-568. The crew managed to keep the flooding isolated in the forward fire room, and the ship was able to escape the danger and make it to Reykjavik for temporary repairs and back to New York for permanent repairs. 11 men were killed and another 22 wounded. This incident was one of several reasons cited by Hitler's declaration of war on the U.S. as justification of formally opening hostilities. USS Gwin DD-433 was operating with battleships Washington and South Dakota on course to intercept a Japanese naval task force on 14 November 1942. The 2 groups of ships made contact shortly before midnight. While dueling with the cruiser Nagara, Gwin took a shell hit in her engine room while another shell struck her fantail. Her damage was negligible, and she continued to fire at any enemy ship within range. On 30 January 1943, While supporting landings on the northern coast of Rendova Island, Gwynn was hit by shore-based shell fire in her main deck, which stopped her engine, killed 3 men, and wounded 7 others. The ship returned to the States for repairs and an overhaul, and was back in the combat zone by April 1943. On 13 July 1943, during the Battle of Kolombangara, Gwynn was turning with formation to bring all main batteries to bear on 4 enemy destroyers, when the Japanese ships released a salvo of over 30 torpedoes at the Americans. At approximately 2:10, U.S. ships were hit by a spread of torpedoes from the destroyers Yukikaze, Hamikaze, Kiyanami, and Ugyur, including Gwynn, which was hit amidships by a torpedo in her engine room. When damage control efforts failed, the ship was abandoned and was scuttled by Ralph Talbot, DD-390, with a loss of 61 men. USS Meredith, DD-434, was towing supplies on a barge to U.S. forces holding Guadalcanal on 12 October 1942, when it was discovered that a Japanese carrier task force was nearby, and all ships were to turn back immediately. The commander of Meredith decided to continue to deliver the urgently needed supplies. On 15 October 1942, Meredith was sighted by a Japanese scout plane and was soon attacked by 38 enemy planes from the aircraft carrier Zuikaku. Several bombs struck the bridge, knocking out all communications, steering, and gun control. Although the crew of Meredith fought bravely and fiercely, the ship was hit by possibly 14 bombs and 7 torpedoes. Just 10 minutes after the attack began, Meredith capsized and sank, taking 192 men down with her. USS Monson, DD-436, was operating as a part-task group 67.4 under command of Rear Admiral Callaghan on 13-14 November 1942, when the task force engaged in the naval battle of Guadalcanal. At approximately 02:20, Monson believed she spotted friendly signal lamps and responded. These were in fact star shells, as the Japanese destroyers Asugumo, Murasame, and Samadare opened fire and blasted Monson, followed by the battleship Hiei bushwhacking the destroyer. Within 2 minutes she took at least 39 shell hits, and Monson was quickly reduced to a burning hulk. 20 minutes later, completely immobilized and burning furiously, she was ordered abandoned. The burning ship floated for several hours in Iron Bottom Sound before finally sinking. She lost 130 of her crew during the battle. USS Ludlow, DD-438, was participating in the Operation Torch landings at Casablanca on 8 November 1942, when its 700 French shore batteries opened fire on the landing American troops. Several American destroyers were called forward to silence the batteries. During the gunnery duel at 7:20, Ludlow was hit by a shell which caused minimal damage and no casualties. The ship returned to New York for repairs and rejoined the war in January 1943. USS Nicholson, DD-442, was participating